Happy Thursday, Non-Obvious Nation. It is time for another roundup of the most interesting and exciting stories of the week. We have, as usual, another amazing special guest a little bit later in the show. Before we do that, we want to talk about some of the interesting stories that you might have missed this week. And the first one I want to share with you is a very, very creative way of using postage stamps to tell a story. The Finnish Post commissioned these new postage stamps that are heat activated that allow for a story to be told about what will happen when the world and the earth heats up and climate change starts to change our weather patterns, and the stamps react to the heat of your thumb. And it's just a beautiful, creative way of bringing this story to life in a way that is powerful and interesting for people. Another one of the non-obvious stories this week that I'd like to feature is a kind of disturbing survey from a British trade group that surveyed 2,000 musicians and found that actually a little bit over 1/3 of them were considering leaving the professional industry of music just because of the pandemic. And it's such a shame, but it's also a reminder, at least it was for me, that I think I need to do more to support the artists and the musicians that I really listen to and that I love. And so hopefully you'll take this story as a reminder of the same thing for you. Another one of the non-obvious stories this week was about the big fat Indian wedding, which if you've ever been to an Indian wedding, and especially if you've been to one in India, you know that the typical size for a wedding, the typical invite size is about 1,000 people, maybe even more, which sounds insane to anybody who grew up outside of India, I know. But one of the silver linings of the pandemic is apparently it's made it more socially acceptable to just invite the people you actually want to your wedding, which is a nice way to think about a wedding instead of the 1,000 people that you kind of have to invite anyway. So maybe the big fat Indian wedding will be shifted dramatically in a way that it hasn't been for generations. And another non-obvious story was about author photos and how sometimes they're used to judge a book, not by the cover of the book, but by the photo of the author. And what you're looking at here is one of the more entertaining author photos that I've taken in the past of me kind of surrounded by these Post-it notes, because a big part of my process is sorting through lots of ideas and finding the meaning among the noise. And this was a photo meant to illustrate that. And, you know, I have to say, this author photo did generate media attention. It did get more people kind of paying attention to some of the work that I did. So there is something to this idea of having the author photo be a driver of interest for people. As many of you know, longtime watchers of the show and longtime readers of my email newsletter, every week I also feature a brand new book release of the week. So a book that just came out. And this week's book of the week is called If Then by Jill Lepore. And it's a really interesting deep dive into a corporation that many of us haven't heard of, which was initially around in the 1950s called Simulmatics. And what they essentially did is what Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and all of these companies now have been doing, but they did it 60 years earlier. And it was taking data to understand humans, understand persuasion, impact elections, change the way we see the world. And it was this sort of shadow corporation that operated in a very mysterious way and then kind of disappeared. And the book is about how the author went and found all of these archives at MIT and unearthed the story and retold it. It's already won a number of business and nonfiction book awards. Highly, highly recommended. Really looks interesting. I haven't finished it, but it really looks fascinating. Definitely recommend it. So every week I share stories like this. And if you want to dig into any of the stories in further depth, you can always subscribe to my email newsletter, which comes out every Thursday morning on the East Coast where I am, but depending on where you are, because many of you are in different parts of the world, it may be afternoon or evening for you, but it's Thursday, every Thursday. And the lead story in that is actually something that leads into my amazing guest for this week, which is humor. And the humor is not the guest, humor is the topic. And this story from the New York Times really came at a fortuitous time because I knew I was interviewing Tom Fishburne, who is going to be the guest this week. And he is also known, more widely known, I think, as the Marketoonist, a cartoonist who does business cartoons primarily for marketing and business people to spotlight some of the interesting, curious, silly, sad, desperate things that we do in business that maybe we don't necessarily think about. And I'm so excited to have him here because we're going to talk about one of the ideas that came in this article, which was laughtivism. Can humor be a force for change? Can it be a force for persuasion? And I'm so excited to have Tom on the show. And so the first thing I'd like to do is just say, welcome to the show, Tom, and thank you for joining us today.
Love the term laughtivism.
Yeah, it's a great term, isn't it? And one of the quotes in the article was a George Orwell quote that said, "Every joke is a tiny revolution." And I thought that an interesting question to start with for you would be, if every joke is a revolution, do you see yourself as a marketing revolutionary? I mean, can you impact change by spotlighting some of the crazy, stupid, in some cases, things that we do as marketers and business people, and perhaps get us to rethink them? And is that your intent with the cartoon, or is it, something else?
It's a great question. I've never thought of myself as a revolutionary, but it's been more a chance, I think, to expose things we all think, but sometimes they're hard to talk about. And that in a revolutionary context can be really powerful. But even in a context where it is a free exchange of ideas, and inside a company where you may feel a little bit uncomfortable sharing your real views on things, that's a particularly important environment to get things out into the open. And so that's how I really started it. I was just an associate marketing manager at General Mills. I'd drawn cartoons in the student newspaper at Harvard Business School for 2 years before that. I started seeing all these crazy, ridiculous things happening around me. And I thought of it really as my own personal diary in this environment, and making fun of the things I was going through, often using myself as the butt of the joke. And then I found that it resonated with others who were experiencing the same thing. So I came at it more from that angle. But I think in a revolutionary context, it can absolutely be revolutionary. I had the chance to live in the Czech Republic a few years after the fall of communism. And one of the things I came across were Samizdat publications, which was basically underground magazines and newspapers that people would build printing presses in their basements. And I found a collection of these in an exhibit, and cartoons were throughout. They were both very serious material, critiquing the government. They were reprinting things that could be considered revolutionary from other countries. But then there are also cartoons using humor as a way to deflate it, to kind of help make the medicine go down, and using laughter as a way to share in that.
Yeah, there really is a rich history of cartoons in general being able to do that in a way that maybe articles or news media or even documentaries struggle to do. Because the thing is with humor, I was actually talking with my wife Chavi about this before, just in preparing for the show. This idea that there's roll on the floor laughter. You go to a stand-up comedy show and it's like you're just laughing so hard that your stomach hurts. And then there's the type of humor that I think you get from a cartoon, which is a little bit different. It's sort of a make you think humor where it's funny, but it also like has an insight behind it. And I'm curious if you see it the same way, and how do you come to some of those insights? Are you just highly trained in observing them? Do you have a process? I mean, let's dig into the process a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so much of it, like I mentioned, as a diary, so much of it is driven out of my own experience, just trying to make sense of what I'm experiencing. And I think part of the reason that cartoons work is that it's a little bit participatory. When you look at a cartoon, you put yourself in the cartoon inherently to really make the joke work. Particularly a classic single panel cartoon, there's an image, there's a caption, and you as the viewer have to put the two together and figure out why it's funny. And in many cases, you can see yourself in the cartoon. It becomes a reflection of who you are. And so for me, it started that way. It was really a chance for me to process some of the things I was thinking about. My process really starts often with some sort of pain point, something that bothers me. It's often, things, in this case, should we schedule our next Zoom meeting or just hit ourselves repeatedly in the head with a hammer? That's a literal pain point. So it's usually something that I'm like, something's bothering me about a situation. Let me see if I can find a comedic way to represent that pain point. And usually the pain point is something I'm experiencing personally, but I hope and expect that others are experiencing that too. So it's participatory. It's this shared experience that we're all sort of have this shared pain point. That's usually my starting point. And then it's a lot of iterations. That photo of you, the artist photo surrounded by Post-it notes, that could easily be a photo of me surrounded by all the sketches I make as I lead to whatever cartoon I ultimately want to draw. It's very iterative.
Yeah, and you do share, I mean, what we're looking at here is one of your sketches that then turned into the cartoon. And what I think is really interesting about this is the visual is sort of already there. And what it looks like you're kind of working on is finding the best words to bring it to life. Is that so? How much of the work is in the drawing of it, and how much of the work is really in developing, like, what are those few words that you're going to say to get the joke or the insight across very quickly?
I usually start with the image and some rough idea of the words, and then the words come late. That particular example you shared was a little bit later in the process, where I usually have literally stacks of index cards I go to, where I'm first playing really with really rough, loose ideas. Actually on the left here, you can see I kind of categorize my ideas in progressive stages. There's sort of a stimulus stage in the upper left where I have just things I'm reading around the pain point that I've experienced. Then I move to something I call scraps. They're just sort of things that are a little bit further evolved. And then I move to something called stubs, which is kind of like a Wikipedia stub for an idea, where I know there's something that could turn into a cartoon. I'm not sure how. And then eventually gets to close, where it's like there's something sort of fleshed out, but I need to think about how many characters are there, what situation are they in. And then ready is really at the point in that last drawing where it's actually a situation that's pretty well articulated, and then I can take it to create that ink version was really a rough before making the final. So it goes through each of those stages, and I usually don't go through it all in one sitting. I find a lot of the process for me is subconscious. So I'll sit down and I have to kind of get my mind in the gear and kind of keep telling myself, I'm in the zone right now where I'm early stage, processing stimulus. I don't need to come up with a final idea. And it's important to suspend my critical mind until as late as possible in the process, so that it doesn't muck things up. Because usually the fun stuff comes from just that loose exploration. And then later in the process, the critical mind sort of takes over, and I'm thinking about it much more like an editor would. So that's how my process goes. That's over days.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting for me in that process is something that I've heard from many people. And actually, Isaac Asimov talked about it a lot when people kind of looked at his prolificness of how many books he was able to write in his lifetime. And it was hundreds and hundreds of books on lots of different topics. And people asked him, like, are you just a faster writer than everyone else? And one of the things he said really stuck with me, because what he talked about is this idea that he never has writer's block because he's always simultaneously working on multiple books. And so he'll work on something for a while, and when it gets to a point where his creative energy has been exhausted on that, he'll just switch and start writing another book. And if we think about this idea of multitasking, which has been one of those big concepts out there and really controversial, I think, for some people, because they say, oh, multitasking is just like total distraction and you're never actually getting anything done. And other people say, well, I'm just a great multitasker. I can do lots of stuff. And I think really what it comes down to is being able to quickly switch and optimize your time. So I wonder how important is that kind of quick switching, always thinking about multiple cartoons at once, as opposed to just, okay, I got to work on this week's cartoon and that's it.
Great. It's a great question. I think of myself a little bit like a unit tasker rather than a multitasker, in that I have many projects going on at once that all have different creative needs, and they're often at very different stages of that process. I find myself in the early morning, I'm much more conducive to the crazy blue sky creative thinking. And so usually when I'm kind of playing around with ideas, when I have projects at that stage, I assign those for my morning slot. And I do block it so that I don't get distracted, because I find I need to get into a deep thinking zone. I turn off my phone. I listen to the same album over and over again. I have a couple of rituals to get in that zone. And then, but to your point, I have a lot of things cooking, so that when I get to a point where I start to get tired, I shift gears and then I move into something that's a little bit further along. I can look at things that are nearly finished ideas, and then I can start to play with layout. And then really it moves like that through the rest of the day. And then the afternoon is primarily about drawing. Which I can do without a lot of mind power, but it just sort of, I think it was like the dessert of the project. I love doing that. That's when I can listen to podcasts and do other things while I'm drawing. So I find I am within each activity, but then I have lots of activities going on.
And is it just, I mean, you got to have that quiet zone, or it sounds like you are doing other things, like you're listening to podcasts. And I'm curious, just in the overall week, I mean, you produce a new cartoon every week. In the overall week, is that a full-time job to produce that one cartoon, or is that kind of part of your week and then other stuff takes up kind of the other part of the time?
That's just a part. I have, most of what I do are client types of things. So companies will pay me either to create marketing campaigns for them using cartoons, or create internal culture change projects using cartoons. And that's the bulk of my time. And my weekly cartoon fits into that process. But my output is much greater. It's usually 20 or so cartoons that I'm drawing on a typical week. And so when I'm in the morning creative zone, I block all distractions. It's just music, things that won't get in my head. and then in the afternoon zone is when I can let my mind range a little bit. But yeah, so yeah, that's a part of the role. And it started out, that was just my sideline hobby. I had a day job in the weekly cartoon, which is something I added on top of that. And now that for the last 10 years, I've been doing this, as a full-time thing. I've been really focused on optimizing my creative process so I can have more creative output without sacrificing it, because I'm juggling so many plates. So I learn a lot from other cartoonists and creative thinkers about their processes. And it's funny how so many end up in this sort of a similar sort of pattern of needing to have, separate the creative from the critical mind, and needing to day part certain activities to make sure that you're creative.
Yeah, I think, one of the interesting questions that just came in from my friend Gotham, which is really interesting, is the idea of cancel culture and cartoons and humor and what you can get away with humor. And I wonder if, when you think about the topics for cartoons and how you're putting them together, are there topics or themes that are off limits? Are there things that you just stay away from and don't do? And what have you ever had kind of a backlash to something where people are just really angry?
Such a great question. I think so. Typically, I've decided over time to really focus on what I can uniquely do, which is that I come from a business background, so I tend to focus on business topics. And as a result of that, I'm not as much in the popular culture. So there's certain areas that many cartoonists will touch on that are much more in zones that could expose them more than my work in corporate environments, because I tend to think about the environments where I'm working and what topics are most relevant to them. I have, over time, I've sort of developed this attitude that humor can be an act of empathy, and that it's ultimately about really listening to the environment that you're working within, the audience that you're trying to reach, and having empathy for that audience, so that the topics that you cover can really relate. There's a professor out of Ontario named Rod Martin who's kind of done a lot of research on different forms of humor, and he's defined 4 different broad categories of humor that a lot of people fall into. And there's a spectrum across those 4. One polarity has to do with aggressive humor, which is making fun at others, and versus affiliative humor, which is laughing with others. And in my personal zone, I've always tried to go toward laughing with others. So I pay a lot of attention to what's humorous, but then also what's done in a sensitive way to make sure that it's inclusive. And that's just the way that I've worked. But that doesn't mean that I can't tackle certain subjects. I just have to do it with a certain level of sort of empathy, the way I'm approaching it. And I did get some backlash early on when I was working in a big organization, often drawing things that made fun of the company where I was working. But it was usually my colleagues who thought I was going to get fired for it. And then eventually I got called in front of the executive in the company, and I thought I was going to get fired. And actually, what he said was, "You're actually saying things that are really important to say. I want you to keep doing it." And it struck me at that point that I always want to work in environments where they'll celebrate the fact that I'm challenging things through cartoons and humor toward a pursuit to make things better, versus an environment that might try to clamp down on that. So that became sort of a filter mechanism for me. And then I realized that actually, but my biggest filter is my own. I worry so much. I have such imposter syndrome. I worry about how things are going to be perceived. I often have to get more comfortable in putting myself out there. And that as long as I'm doing it, again, with a sense of empathy and caring the best that I can, and being willing to learn, for myself about the experience, that's a safer place to be. And it's helped over time that I now have an audience that's been reading it regularly for 18 years. So I really respect that audience, that relationship too.
Yeah, and you've built a great audience. I mean, you have a ton of subscribers who get this cartoon in their email inbox. And by the way, if you're not subscribed to get the weekly cartoon from Tom, Marketoonist.com is his website. Go and subscribe there. Start digging through the archive. Make sure that you have some free time, because you will get sucked in a good way to start reading some of the past cartoons, and it'll be really, really excellent. So definitely do that. I wonder if we could talk about the empathy piece for a moment. One of the things that if you look at kind of other cartoons that are incisive and looking at our culture, they make a few choices in how they're told. And I'm curious about some of the choices that you made and whether they were intentional. So for example, you don't have a lead character like Dilbert. the characters are sort of anonymized. You do bring in diversity in terms of the people that you're showing of different skin tones, as much as you can show in a cartoon, which I imagine is intentional to show that there's not one-dimensional, this kind of world that you're creating. But is it intentional that you don't really have characters? Do you have recurring characters? Did you think about that and decide not to do it? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question. We're all influenced by our influences. And one of my biggest influences was, of course, Gary Larson in The Far Side. And I've heard him describe his cartoons as really the characters are more like props than they are like characters. He's trying to convey single panel jokes and whatever props he can pull into the joke to help communicate in as simply a form as possible. That's sort of the approach that he took. And I naturally started gravitating toward that because it gave such, in my mind, flexibility. I was facing all these situations and I found myself in this diary mindset where I was just wanting to, convey as best as I could this one little moment in time and not have to be subject to remembering all the baggage of characters. So it just kind of flowed organically out of my experience. And then over time, I thought about occasionally rising, bringing certain characters up to the top and having them represent certain things. And I found it restrictive. Which is different than other cartoonists I know who find it really, freeing to have characters, because if you're stuck for a joke, all you have to do is put 2 or 3 characters together that you know really well, and a storyline will emerge from that. So it just became a matter of personal preference. But on the aspect of diversity, that's absolutely something I wanted to include early on. I've been fortunate that, where I went to business school, there was a high diversity in the students around me, kind of internationally, within the U.S., et cetera. And I found I wanted to really convey that. And I think as much less about the individual characters in the cartoon, but I do think a lot about who, if anybody, is the butt of the joke in the cartoon. I want to make, if somebody is acting foolish or they're saying something that doesn't, is insensitive, I do sometimes think about who that character is, because I don't want any viewer to look at that and say, oh, that person is saying that thing insensitively because of some aspect of their character, their gender, their race, anything like that. So I do think about power dynamics in the cartoons as best as I can. And then I just try to learn over time from that to find a way that makes sense. Mm. So it's deliberate in that sense. But usually, in my mind, for my type of cartooning, the joke in the scenario comes first, and then the characters kind of come second to help represent whatever that situation or story is.
Is it more important to you when you're doing a cartoon to be funny or insightful?
Yeah, that's another good question. I lean on being funny. I want to, usually I'm going after a topic because it's something that I think is relevant in a deeper sense. Things started to evolve and change a bit for me 10 years or so, maybe 13 years ago, when I started blogging alongside the cartoon. So for every cartoon, I would also write a few hundred words unpacking the business situation. And if the cartoon tees up the problem, then my article tries to provide a potential solution to the problem. And in doing that, I started really focusing my subject matter around situations around me that weren't just funny, but actually had some point. So it usually starts with something from a point. But then my filter mechanism is I don't want to just have commentary. I want to have a cartoon that actually does have a shared laughter. And then usually if there's any butt of the joke, it's often me personally, because I feel like, in the world of marketing, so much in the last 18 years has changed so dramatically. Nobody has all the answers. We're all figuring stuff out. I'm making every single mistake that's represented in my cartoons. And so if I start from that place, then, going back to that idea about it being affiliative humor, it's a shared laughter that we're all going through this together. I want to laugh, but then also challenge myself to think, how can I get better and approach things better?
Yeah, and it's funny that you say at the butt of every joke is you, because I think a lot of people who read them probably feel the same way about themselves, which is to that point of it feels really inclusive, which is a fantastic thing to have across a lot of these cartoons. I wonder if we could shift gears a little bit and talk about the business model side of this, because you have these cartoons, you publish them online for free. People are used to stealing stuff online for free. And yet you have a licensing model, and people should pay for them if they're using them in presentations and newsletters and websites. And you have you call it your easy peasy licensing model. And I have to say, as somebody who's licensed and paid for your images in the past, when I use them, it is very easy to do. But I wonder how what you have learned by being a content producer that is putting content out there that isn't really locked down. I mean, it's not behind a paywall. It's not only for subscribers. It's kind of freely available. Anybody could, hopefully they don't, but anybody could do a Google search and find these cartoons and just choose to download them to the computer and use them. And probably many people do. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do you get people to actually understand what the licensing rules are to choose to pay the money? And then on the flip side, how do you, if you do, kind of chase those people who don't do that? Or do you have kind of a legal process to get people to take? I mean, some people have a very deep legal process, right? To say, hey, you're not using this image in the right way and you need to take it down or pay the licensing fee. And so how aggressive are you in policing that?
Yeah, great questions. It's all they're trade-offs, obviously. In my view, I started out, again, this is a hobby to my day job. So I really wanted to just get my work out into the world. And then I found that people wanted to use the cartoons for various things. And many of them started approaching me. I want to make sure that I'm compensating you for this use. And that's when I started to really build licensing into it. But as far as the trade-off, I wanted to make sure that I leaned toward defaulting to an open position to try to get my work out into the world as much as possible, and also provide an easy way for those to license them fairly. It's entirely done by an honor code. I don't go out and chase things. But I find particularly those who license repeatedly and they subscribe over time, there is a relationship there, and there are many people who do the right thing and want to have a proper license, particularly for business use. And so that's been a great relationship, and I love that. The only ones that we ever go out and chase are when oftentimes my own audience will police for me. They'll see an example of when my cartoon is out there and they've stripped out my name, or they changed the caption to mean something different than what I said. Or in some cases, they'll I've seen cases where somebody obviously put it, traced over my cartoon, so it's the same characters in the same places but slightly different, and then translate into another language and start serializing.
It must be frustrating. I mean, it must be frustrating to see that,
because I feel like that really feels like stealing more than anything. So that's the approach I've taken with that. But part of it is, as the business model evolved, again, I didn't think that this would be my business, and I think that was helped by the fact that for the first 10 years, I did this just for fun and for free, primarily. But over time, through the custom work, I started to realize there was a business model there. And so I've heard it described as the minnows versus the whale strategy. If you have purely licensing or selling merchandise or that type of thing, you have to have a lot of people willing to spend a small amount of money. And in my view, I try to give my cartoons primarily away, as broadly as possible, because there are fewer people out there who want to do deep, immersive custom projects, and that's the bulk of the revenue model for us, is to do those types of projects. So that's oftentimes somebody will reach out and say, I've been following your work for the last 15 years and would love to find a way to work with you on a project, and then we work on a great project together. So that's the priority business model.
It's really, I mean, it strikes me as really a long game that you're playing here, where you have that continual engagement, and it's a model that many of us see. I mean, I to some degree I use the same model, right? The more content that is valuable I put out every week for free with the show and with the email newsletter, the more I'm constantly staying in front of people, so that at that point when eventually they say, oh, we need someone to come in and do this, or we need to do a training session, or we need to do need to bring in a speaker, and same for you, they'll think of you first because you have this constant kind of reminder of working with you. So I think that certainly does work. I've seen it work. You've obviously seen it work as well. We did have a question come in from Graham that I thought was interesting about influences and what influences you when it comes to humor, style. What are you constantly sort of looking at and consuming, both to come up with ideas and also maybe creatively from a style point of view?
Yeah, great. So certainly a lot of cartoons, like as a child, influences. I mentioned Gary Larson, Bill Watterson from Calvin and Hobbes, Berkeley Breathitt, Bloom County, like the classic newspaper staples. Then Matt Groening became a big influence on me. Before The Simpsons, he had a alternative comic called Life in Hell, which made a big influence on me as a kid. So I had all these childhood influences. And then over time, I love getting inspired and interested by other types of cartoons I came across. My favorite cartoonist is Jean-Jacques Sampé, who's a French cartoonist. He does a lot of New Yorker covers as well, but I discovered him when I was traveling in France. And I've had the experience now, whenever I get to travel somewhere to an event to do a speaking engagement, I always make my way to the closest bookstore to find examples of cartoonists from whatever region I'm in, whether it's, whether I'm in Israel or the Middle East.
Is there a club of some sort? Like, do all of you know one another? I mean, is it like a small kind of cartoonist? Is there like a cartoonist community?
There is. There are a few. The oldest one in the United States is called the National Cartoonist Society, which was started in the 40s. And I've been to a number of their live events. I'm a member of that. And it's wonderful. I brought my kids to it and gave them each a sketch pad and had them ask them to walk them, just tap anybody they see on the shoulder and have them draw something. And suddenly came back with all these amazing cartoons from all these sources you recognize and a lot you wouldn't. So I love that, because it is in many ways a solitary profession. So the chance to actually get together and have some fellowship is really powerful. So there are a few groups like that get together, and a lot of support online. People often know each other's work and reach out, and you have a lot of chances for one-on-one conversations. But it's a wonderful community. But people, obviously, cartooning goes in so many different directions. What you would describe as a cartoon can go in so many different directions. So I get inspired by those cartoonists, but then also comedians. So I love Sarah Cooper's work, for instance. She's gotten a lot of press with her TikTok videos, but even before that, she had a form of cartoon. When she was at Google, she ended up creating a book out of this called How to Appear Smart in Meetings, and she had very simple drawings with things that people would say. And so I love seeing examples of just comedy coming up in lots of different places. I get inspired by all of that.
That's fantastic. And you did mention, I mean, one of the things that we're kind of coming to the close of our time together. So I think maybe a good place to close this would just be in terms of the broader impact that some of these insights that come through your cartoons might be able to have. And I'm curious if over the time that you've been doing this, you've seen something that has sort of come out of that as a result or as a movement. Or you mentioned that cartooning is a sort of a solitary activity, but since you have so many people who are constantly consuming that content and you're probably hearing from many of them, how much of that could translate into creating this better business world where we don't just focus on making the logo bigger? How much of that could kind of result in the type of business specifically, but maybe even the type of culture that we would all prefer to live in?
Yeah, there's a few years ago, I had a chance to be a cartoonist in residence at a Stanford Business School class about the power of humor in business. And one of their guests was a man named Hiroki Asai, who's an executive at Apple. And he had this great quote that fear kills creativity and humor is our most powerful tool to drive fear out of the system. And most of the stories I hear back from folks, and I do hear frequently, I'm very fortunate people will write me and tell me stories of going on what's on in their culture. A lot of it is about that effort to drive fear out of the system, that getting everybody to laugh together at the same things that are otherwise hard to talk about can actually help things move on. And some of my more interesting kind of custom projects have been specifically focused on driving organizational culture change, where there's somehow the organization is getting stuck, and people are uncomfortable sharing what's going on or what their obstacles are. And then the company kind of brings me in and I work with them on let's really bring those obstacles to life through cartoons. The executives can show we can laugh at ourselves. Here's things that we're, in a sense, giving permission to laugh about these things, and therefore talk about them and move forward. And the best example that comes to mind is DBS Bank in Singapore. I had a chance to work with them on a culture change project, and it was remarkable, not only in creating the cartoons, but sometimes the meetings where there'd be 15 executives in a room, and they're in a bank. It's not the most laugh-inducing culture, but we would bring up some issues, and there would be suddenly it was like letting the air out of the balloon. Suddenly, everybody was laughing. They were talking about things, and that shift in the vibe was just palatable for me listening in on it. And so that's what I often think about, with my own cartoons, is trying to create that sort of response.
That's amazing. Well, I want to say thank you for just sharing some of the creative process behind what you do. It is definitely non-obvious. to the point of the show. And this has just been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we could go for much, much longer, but we do want to limit the time here. So I want to leave with just a quick reminder to everyone that if you enjoyed the show and you enjoy Tom's cartoons, definitely visit marketoonist.com. Check out his work, subscribe to his email newsletter where you'll get a new cartoon every week. And if you like them, pay for them and license them properly, because that is important to support great work and to support smart people. So that's our interview for today. That's our show for today. Thank you for being part of everything. Thank you for all the support. And remember, always, always stay non-obvious.